everybody, welcome to the Shakespearean Shrew. I am your Shakespearean Shrew, Karen Feiner, lover of all things bard and poetry. And so today we are going to be talking to Mitch Laman. I am so excited. I actually first met Mitch as a student in my Shakespeare class, and recently I got to listen to one of his lectures, and I was so excited to have you on this podcast and to talk to you about impossibility and the boundaries and poetry and all the fun things. And so thank you so much for joining me.
Well, I'm excited to be here. Like you said, it was strange, serendipitous that we met when I was your student, and then later it was just, I don't know, this all lined up and everything. So I'm very excited to be here, very excited to talk.
So first and foremost, poetry is it seems like it's your happy place.
Yeah, I would call it that. It's not always happy, but it's my happy place.
So what you were talking about in the lecture that I was able to go to was a lot about the mediums of poetry and how the medium can really impact the content.
Yeah.
And so I think that's it. As a Shakespearean, as somebody who loves Shakespeare, I find that so fun because I yell about that all the time.
Yeah.
When people are like, "Oh yeah, read Shakespeare so that you can understand him better," and I'm going, "That's not how Shakespeare is supposed to be."
Right. You're supposed to watch Shakespeare,
right?
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so for you, I feel like it's a similar thing.
Yeah.
So what do you do with that, with the medium of your poetry, in order to get it out into the world in a way that fits with the content?
Yeah, it's difficult. And I think it's a constant negotiation is kind of the answer. Because a poem that gets read aloud at a poetry reading, as opposed to that same poem, same text, same content, same lyrics, being written down in a journal, the sort of thing that you would buy that you get monthly, or even the same thing on the wall of an art museum, or the thing in your journal or diary, something personal you would never mean to share. Even if the lyrics of those things are identical, right? Those mediums are going to change how you approach them, how you consume them. And so you have to consider it whenever you put a poem into a new medium, into a new space. So for me, right, most of my poems start written. I write them down first. But then obviously poetry reading is a part of the genre. So it's something I do. It's something I go out and I have to read the poems. And when I do go out to read the poems, it's often difficult. It's difficult to choose a poem to read. And then from there, it's difficult to renegotiate the new medium, the new space that it's being put into, because I think that the physicality of the page, the way that it's been written down, the spacing on the page even just, or the margin size, or the gap between lines is so much a part of that poetry that when I go to read it out loud, I'm like, well, what do I do? How do I change that? How do I translate that? And I don't know, I think the key is to consider the new affordances of that new medium, whatever you're bringing it into. When I read a poem out loud, I lose a lot in visuality. Right, I can no longer arrange the words how I want them to be on the page. But in exchange, I get something in expression, in tone, in the way that I deliver those words, right? In the tone that I have, in the body language I use even when I'm at the front. So I think that's what I would say, especially when you think about Shakespeare, when you think about these plays that are meant to be performed, but typically they get read in English high school classes.
Yes.
And they're not performed.
And then everybody hates them.
Yeah, right. Everybody's like, "Oh man, this is awful." It's okay, well, yeah, because you're not engaging with it on its own terms. Right. So I would say, one, to go and engage with it on its own terms. Go watch Shakespeare, if you can, if any way. And YouTube is free. You can watch those plays, right? You can watch performances of them. But I also think when we read a poem, or when we read a play, I think that there is something to that experience. Because I read Shakespeare plays just for my own, on my own time. And there is something interesting in that, in the way that you can read it. It's interesting that I can read a Hamlet monologue and go back through it, that I can finish the last line and go reread the first one. And so that's something you couldn't do in a real performance. And maybe it's not something Shakespeare intended us to do, but it is interesting.
Stop looking so close.
Yeah. But it's still interesting. It's still something interesting. So I don't know. I think as long as we're conscious of what our medium is doing to the art that we're consuming, then we can always find interesting things in it. And maybe the problem with the high school English classroom event is just that they're not doing that work. They're not thinking about how it needs to change when we're reading it.
And I think the other problem is, for me, I always hated being assigned thing. Like as soon as you assigned me something, I hated it, even if it was wonderful. Like I'd go back later and I'd read it and I'm like, that was amazing. But in the moment, I've refused. Like, I would either just not read it or I would hate it on principle. And I think that's the other problem, is that there's so much restrictiveness in the academic system that it turns a lot of students away from enjoying.
Exactly, right? Because you're thinking about it like homework. You're thinking about it like, oh, this is a chore. This is a thing I have to do.
Right.
So you're not ready to, you're not willing, you're not in the headspace maybe.
Right, you're not experiencing it.
Yeah, exactly. To really enjoy it or appreciate it, experience it the way that Shakespeare probably intended it to.
So as a poet, and I think Shakespeare would probably say yes to this one, but you described poetry readings and your body language and your tone and voice. So are poets actors?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. There's definitely a part of that. It really is. It often does feel like I'm monologuing when I'm at a poetry reading. When I'm out there reading poetry to people, it is a performance. It totally is. I'm performing. I'm showing. There's a show that I'm putting on, and the poem is a part of it. It's my script. The only difference, I guess, from the play is that it's just me, and I wrote it. It's a
one-man show.
Exactly, right? It's entirely contained in my performance. I tell you where we are, what's happening, what it's doing, and then perform it. But I definitely think there's lots of overlap there between those.
Yeah. Is there a lot of poetry reading in the area? Is that?
Actually, there is. There definitely is. Well, I live in Norman, outside of the university, where we both teach. But, and so over there's probably less, but there still are. There still totally are.
Because I know the Red Dirt Collective is up at Literati, right up the street in Paseo. And then I know Green Feather.
Green Feather is the one I was going to say. And Norman is really great. Green Feather is really great in Norman. They do the readings. And then there's other events that sort of maybe are less regimented, less scheduled. I don't know, the Mark Allen Everett Poetry Series, if you've ever heard it. Out in Norman, they're wonderful. They're wonderful. They just put on poetry readings. That's all they do. They just put on poetry readings a few times a year, and it's wonderful. I've been to a few. I've read a few, but they're terrific. They're terrific too.
So is it almost like open mic where you just go sign up and
the Mark Allen Everett ones are more scheduled. You would contact somebody beforehand. You'd get in, and then they'd have you on a list. You pull up, and then you read your poetry. But most of the Green Feather one is open mic. And most of them, I feel like, around Norman and OKC are open mic. You just come and you listen to great poetry, read poetry. And oftentimes they're also mixed mics. Like sometimes it won't just be poetry. Like somebody will go up there and read a short fiction piece or something. Or something like that. And it's all really interesting stuff. And honestly, it's hard to say that a short fiction piece that's 2 minutes long, it's hard to say that isn't a poem. It's hard to say that isn't a play, right? It's the overlap between them all gets great when you get to a poetry reading.
Right. And I think that's half the fun, right? Is the blurring of lines, the pushing of boundaries, which is a really great segue. So your poetry, first of all, pushes a lot of boundaries.
That's the hope.
Why? Why is that the hope? Why is that the intention for your work? Well, at least one of them.
Yeah, I think part of what draws me to poetry, what's always drawn me to poetry, is the flexibility in it. Is the fact that there are still structures that are kind of like grammar, but they're not grammar. There's not actual rules so much as there are systems and systems of meaning. And I don't have to make two words relate to each other. It's not a matter of finding the right verb. It's not a matter necessarily of finding the right grammatic, the piece of punctuation. It's about literally spacing them. It's about spacing them on the page or figuring out how to make their sounds flow into one another. And all of those aesthetic concerns are a big part of why I love poetry, why I love writing it. And so for me, it becomes very natural to then take that logic one step further, to go, all right, what drew me to poetry in the first place is the way that it breaks boundaries, the way that it breaks traditional logics, the way that it breaks how we feel like communication ought to function. And then take it a step further and go, well, how can poetry communicate? When we've softened our commitments to legibility, when we've softened our commitments to grammar and all of those things, when we soften our commitments to prose, now we can all write all kinds of things. We can write strange things. And I love writing strange things. I mean, part of it is just that I think it's fun, definitely. But I love pushing boundaries and I love exploring them. I think it's interesting when I'm writing a poem the way that it can make me think about things. So like one of the poems that I read during the lecture was one I call Homage to the Suffix.
Mhm.
And it's a bunch of made-up words. It's like 20 made-up words in a row. That's all the poem is. But they're made-up words that are produced through real prefixes and suffixes that are taken from like a host of linguistic families, right? And so there's those words, you can look at them, and it feels like they should have meaning.
Right.
It feels like they should mean something, that something is produced in them, even if you don't know what the word means. And so you can look through those words, and you can try to figure out what they mean just from the suffixes, just from the prefixes. The very first word in the poem is oxymoriasis, and it's like just a bunch of Greek sounds smashed together. But it sounds like a medication, maybe?
Or maybe like some kind of a illness or something.
Yeah, it does. It does. But the fact that it produces those impulses, that you're like, oh, that word kind of feels like this,
Yes.
even though it doesn't mean anything at all. I think it's interesting how that exposes the way meaning is produced, the way that our suffixes imply meaning, the way that you can see a word and never have heard it before and be like, I can figure out what that means. I know context clues, or I know what this prefix means, or I know a word that sounds similar, and I don't know, they probably mean something similar. I think that's really interesting. So for me, when I'm writing poetry, exploring those lines and exploring how language works is really fun. It's fun exploring poetry itself.
So what about the impossibility?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That element of meaning where it doesn't it doesn't mean. What is that? I found that very difficult, but in a good way, interesting, because how do you work in that realm of impossible?
Yeah.
And what is the importance of the impossible?
Yeah, so this impossible is a real big keyword in my current research, and I use it a lot. And for me, when I'm talking about impossibility, like when you say something that does not mean, I love that. I think that's terrific, right? It's something, an impossible thing, an impossible poem, an impossible phrase is a phrase which cannot function, a phrase which cannot work in the bounds and the logics that we're used to. And so often these things are not literally impossible. It's not literally impossible to say them. It is practically impossible to say them. It feels impossible. And so for me, in poetry, for instance, right, the most common kind of impossibility I run into is like genre impossibilities. There's these notions that, like, this is what poetry is as a field, and these are not poetry. We were just kind of talking about this, right? That, like, it feels like when you ask a lot of poets, some of them will tell you that poetry is about auditory presentation, right? It's about speaking to other people. Some of them will tell you it's about written things, and that's what it's about. It's all about written things. But for me, poetry is about both those things. I also think it's about visual concerns, right? It's also about visual compositions, like painting is.
Definitely notice that in your piece
as
well.
Yeah, right. It is a visual art to me. And so those things seem impossible when we're operating in the same logics that we're always used to. They seem impossible when and as an educator, as a professor, I feel like you probably feel this, that we kind of reaffirm these boundaries often in the way that we study genre, in the way we talk about genre and scholarship. The way that I will read a piece to my students, and I'll go like, today we're going to read a memoir. At least some way, that kind of implies to them what memoirs are. It tells them, a memoir is this, and a memoir looks like this, and a memoir works this way. And I'm complicit in that, I do that. But I want to break it, I want to. And I think that that's why it's so important, is that when we're not facing these things, when we're not facing them properly, we're not really looking at what is possible, impossible, then we get limited. We can't even see the blinders that have been put on us. There's poems we can never write, things we can never say.
I love that. And it's so funny that you talked about that, because that is one of my things is like, I make my students read all these different examples of a personal narrative. And I'm like, I want you to know how many there are, right? Like we even read a play, Master Harold and the Boys, because it's Athol Fugard's memoir of growing up in apartheid South Africa. Yeah. And so I'm just like, the structures that people put on it, it's just that. People put on these restrictions.
Exactly. Yeah, people put them there.
Exactly.
They look like immutable walls. They look like natural walls. Like, this is what it is. This is what poetry is. This is what a memoir is. This is whatever is. But they're not. They're the result of real historical conditions. The result of things we say in the classroom. They're the result of things we say when we talk to each other about literature. And if we want to change those things, it probably starts with changing how we talk about literature. But it also starts with changing the poems that we write, right? It starts with changing the things we write and trying to write impossible poems, trying to write impossible things. Try to think like, what is it impossible for a poem to do? Okay, I'm gonna do that. And then try to make it happen. I don't know. And if you fall short, you probably learn something in the process. So that's probably useful.
Yeah. So as we're talking about the impossibility, the boundaries, the things that exist and don't exist, it reminds me of the Weird Sisters, and it gives me that vibe, that Becky and Witch vibe, where we're talking about women but not women, and that's literally because of the time period, right? And also metaphorically because, and literarily because of how they were written into the play. And so when you're talking, you mentioned your interest in witches, women, those elements. How does that all fit into your research and what you're studying?
Well, for me, it's really, I kind of consider the witch as this image, this almost ahistorical image. It's because witches have been around forever, right? I mean, the Code of Hammurabi, like the very first legal code, has a law in it that says, "Thou shalt not permit a witch to live." Right there. It's in Exodus, right? It's in everything. It's super, super old. Of witches as this like force of transgressive power, that somehow they changed the world around them through mystical means, through magical means. And what's interesting to me about it is that, especially in the context of something like the Salem witch trials, often the witches are just like women who are trying to change their situation. They're just like women who are like complaining about the status quo. And people are like, "You're a witch. That's crazy. You can't say that." And so for me, the way that breaking impossibility, right, that we can create a kind of real change. I'd like to characterize that as real change. When we break impossible boundaries, when we break those boundaries, we explore that we can create that through language, that we can create that just by speaking to each other, just with incantations and phrases. And so for me, that's kind of how the image of the witch fits in, is that it's an image of transgressive power, of like feminine power that doesn't have its hands on the levers of power, right? It can't change things the way that we would think political change often happens, right? She doesn't have political agency. She doesn't have a voice in the Senate. She casts a spell. She does something mystical. She does something you can't quite understand, but it does have power and it does change things.
I love that idea of the incantation, just being words that incite change.
Yeah.
I love that. I think that really connects because my research is all about the fool. And, that's another character that is all about changing things and revealing things about the society through words and through, I guess, incantations of their own, but more riddles.
Yeah, they have their own style of them. But yeah, it's still the same thing. It's that same linguistic power.
Right, and it's interesting because these individuals who are inciting change are also people who really on their own seem to have no individual power that are somehow outside of society.
Yeah.
Right, which is definitely are on the outs.
Yeah.
But fools as well. They're not considered part of the community. They're always on the boundaries of it. So is it essential to be on the boundary in order to write the boundary or to create those riddles, incantations that force us to push?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific question. And I think you do have to be in those boundary spaces. You do have to be looking at the edges of things. You have to be looking at, you have to be in the fringe. You have to be sort of standing outside of it, if only because of the perspective that it gives you. If only because it's impossible to see the whole sphere when you're in the middle of it, right? You have to be outside the object to be able to see it. And I'm thinking of something like King Lear's fool, right?
Yes.
Who is almost he almost gets removed from like the world. It feels like at times he follows King Lear into exile, and it's like, what? What's like? Okay, I guess he keeps up with him somehow. But
he just disappears. Literally just disappears.
and he's doing all of this stuff. He's outside of these systems. He's moving his way through them in his own path, and because of it, he gets to say some insightful, sharp things that no one else in the play really gets to hit on the nose so hard. So I totally agree. I think you do have to be on the fringe there, if only for the perspective, but also because it gives you a level of freedom. It gives you a level of flexibility, right? When you're pushing on those edges, you're pushing those boundaries, you have more flexibility in what you want to say, how you want to say it. And that's really important when we're trying to push boundaries, when we're trying to say things in new ways.
So I just got to interview David Weber, who is a professional clown. And so that was a delight. But one of the things he talked about was the fact that he is definitely on the boundaries, but he can't afford to push too far because of a lot of the economic debts and the restrictions that exist, and the fact that he has to afford. You have to be able to afford to push the boundaries. And so I thought, because witches never, sorry to all my witches out there, but have never been accepted or put into a position where they were afforded any protection. So they've always been threatened in one way or another. Fools, on the other hand, at some points, the Native Americans had sacred trickster individuals as part of their celebrations, people who pushed back against the sacred and revealed the profane. And, early Elizabethan society had fools, and that went all the way back. And that was something that was a big thing and protected, right? These individuals were on the outsides, but they were protected by the authorities. I'm not sure they are anymore. And I'm not sure the people on the boundaries are afforded the same protections that maybe they once were.
I think that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense to me. I also think part of it is the way that, certain conditions, certain environments produce parts of fringe society that are useful, that do get protected, right? Like with the image of the jester, who gets protected because he serves a function in the court, does something for the king, so it is okay that he is foolish, that he pushes boundaries. And so he gets accepted into it. And even like you're saying with the trickster persona, the trickster figure who gets indoctrinated or gets brought into rituals, who has a ritualistic purpose in the community, who does something for the community, has a function. And so in 2025, and who knows where to draw this line, who knows where to start, where it comes from, where is it starting? But there's no use value in clowns. There's no use value in the fool, in jesters, in people who push boundaries that way. So there's no reason to protect them. The environment, the conditions, the world we live in has no reason to protect them. And the same thing with witches, right? Where it's there's no use value in that. They're not getting use value out of it. But you do see small subcultures produced in the internet, witch communities, right? And those things do come up, those things do appear. And so maybe that's kind of a win for the modern age, that we can do a little bit of worlding, we can do a little bit of creating our own communities, and that maybe provides us some protections. But you're totally right that in 2025, if you can't find a way to turn pushing boundaries into a financially responsible move, then you're not going to be allowed to do it. It's not going to happen.
Right. And I think that is going from caste societies to class societies where there is that economic individualized push. And maybe that is where it started to disappear, is that for the caste, you were in a position, that position defined you. Whereas in a class society, capitalistic society, you basically are what you can earn.
Yeah, exactly, right. And the image of social mobility sometimes becomes a threat of social mobility to move downwards. And I totally agree with that notion of the feudal, the caste system, which was, that's terrible. Not shouting out feudal caste systems or anything. But there's this notion in the feudal system that we all have social roles to play, and that we all have to contribute to each other in ways I have a job, you have a job, together we are a society. And I do think that there's something to be said about how American society never went through that period. We never had the feudal period. So there was never an impulse of we need to work together as a community. We have a bigger function as a community. And I think this is, a big part of the philosophers we read. That we read John Locke instead of John Rousseau, right?
Yes.
Rousseau would tell us, you're supposed to work together as a community. And in America, Locke is more important. And so that's where it's that, I think. Maybe that's where it comes from.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. So in this realm of usefulness, where does the poet sit? Where is the precarious position of the poet?
Yeah, well, the poet is decidedly useless most of the time. The poet does very little for any useful considerations. It's not the poet's goal usually, I don't think. Because what the poet does, the sorts of change that the poet produces, I said earlier that I would like to call them real. And I think that change, I'll call it real. The real change that we produce is still immaterial in a way. Because when I write a really awesome poem and someone reads it and they're like, wow, that's really insightful. I think he made a good point. I'm going to think about this in a new way, right? First off, there's no measurable way to see what that did, right? There's no measurable way to see the impact of my work. But there's also like no way to figure out how much I did as opposed to the other media they've consumed, maybe. Mm-hmm. So it's impossible. So I think to have any usefulness, any use value out of a poet or a poem, because those calculations are too complicated. I don't think we could do them. But I do think that that doesn't mean they're not real, doesn't mean they're not important, doesn't mean the things we do aren't valuable. They're just immaterial in that way. And so for me, admittedly, that's why I'm a professor, right? Yeah. Is that I'm a poet first and foremost, and I do love being a professor. I do enjoy it. I love all of the scholarship, and I like writing like scholastic poetry. I like writing poetry that engages with scholarship and academia. But I mean, first and foremost, it's because being a professor is a job where I, one, get paid. Yes. To have a paycheck. And two, is a job that allows me to talk about these things. It's a job where I get to have a lecture, where I stand up and tell us why we should break boundaries, why we should do the impossible. And so for me, that's my way that I was saying a moment ago, right? It's how I made it financially responsible, is I found an academic job where I could talk about these things, I could talk through them, and then go to the poetry readings on the weekend. Yeah. Right? And that's still important.
I mean, I think it's amazing because, like, for me, that is one of my hardest things. During the summer and the winter is when I write, because during the semester, I'm
no time.
Burnt. Like, I can't balance. I get done grading papers, and then I try to do any kind of writing, and I'm like, I'm a terrible writer. This is awful. Why? And so, how do you balance that aspect? How do you balance the poet and the professor? Because I know, and right now the student, because right now it's...
Yeah, that's true. Finishing masters, everything.
Which mazel, by the way. Congratulations on being at the very end.
Yeah.
I know, right? You're a master. You're RKO, master. Master Mitch. But so how do you deal with that balance?
Yeah, it's difficult, I definitely think. But I think part of it for me is actually that I draw this distinction even in myself between two like halves of what I do. And this is part of why I usually publish poetry under the name Mitch, just the name Mitch, no last name, just the first name, because I'm Professor Laman to my students. And so for me, that distinguishes, I am Mitch Laman, but that constitutes Mitch the poet and Professor Laman. And so in that way, I distinguish between them as almost my two responsibilities, the two things, of life that I lead. But it's difficult. You're totally right that I write so much less for myself during the school year. Of course, so true. There's no way, right? The summer is wonderful. The summer is a blast. I'm finally back to writing consistently all the time, just like, pouring out. But during the school year, it's really, really difficult to get those times. And I find that spending time every day writing is important to me. Spending at least a moment every day writing a poem is important to me. And I think it helps a little bit that I write poetry. Because I know when I talk to prose writers and they're like, I try to write every day, but I get 3 sentences in and I'm like, oh man, I have to go do something else, but I haven't really done anything yet. And they feel all bad about themselves. But like, I can write a 3-sentence poem.
Yep,
and I'm like, awesome. And I move on. So I think it helps for me that I can just make that target goal whatever it needs to be.
So what are some of the big things that have influenced your poetry?
Yeah, I think, J.R.R. Tolkien is the best. I grew up reading Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. It still gets regularly reread. And right? And Tolkien's a poet. He's an incredible poet. He is, of course, one of the great prose artists. But if you haven't read the songs that he puts throughout all Lord of the Rings, they're wonderful. They're so much fun. So that's part of it. I think that's influenced me. I also, and part of that, what Tolkien has led me down when like getting older, looking for more things to read, looking for more stuff to inspire me, is that I read a lot of medieval literature, like medieval poetry, and Shakespeare, right? Obviously, that's a little bit even later than a lot of the stuff I'm thinking of, but Shakespeare's wonderful. And I love reading this like late Middle Ages stuff into like the Renaissance. But if you go back farther, like Dante, love Dante, the comedy, Purgatorio, Inferno, Paradiso. Or I've read a lot of like Anglo-Saxon literature. I don't know if you know Dr. Joyce Coleman at OU, if you've ever met her.
I have not.
Probably not. But she is, I've worked with her before in Anglo-Saxon literature, reading Anglo-Saxon poetry, reading Old English. And it's so interesting to read because it's an active translation that isn't quite like anything else.
Right.
The language is almost English. It's like you can clearly see how it became English, but it still needs to be translated.
Right, but it's still kind of German.
Yeah.
I have to say, I've been studying a lot of German, for obvious reasons, and I can read it so easily because I'm just like, oh, okay. like we just went German, Old English, early modern English, modern English. Cool, got it.
It's crazy. But it's really interesting to read all of that stuff and look through it because I also think it's interesting to me the way that from when the Norman conquest happens in, that's 1000, isn't it? It's like right at 1000 AD, is William comes in with a bunch of French people and Vikings and they take over the Anglo-Saxons and suddenly a bunch of languages are getting mashed together. And then it takes another 600 years, right, before Shakespeare comes along and almost standardizes English. And then it's another 300 years before Webster comes along and actually standardizes English. And so it's interesting to me the way that languages are getting developed over that time. That's part of why I mentioned Dante, because he's like the Shakespeare of Italian. He does all of that work for the Italian language. So when I'm looking at those ways and the ways that languages were getting developed over centuries, it really informs the way I think about meaning making in 2025, the way that languages function in 2025. I was saying earlier, there are boundaries to even our languages, not just genres, but the things that our languages are good at saying. If your language doesn't have a word for something, it's difficult to think on any depth about it. And so that those things, the conditions of our language that impact how we think and speak today, were produced over those centuries. They were produced through the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. And so that stuff is so interesting to me. And so when I read old Anglo-Saxon poetry, which is often broken, fragmented, we don't know the author, we only have like 3 stanzas or something. It's interesting. It's really interesting to see how it's like a cross-section of a tree almost, and it tells you about its history. It tells you how those things have developed over time. And that's really informative for me and how I write poetry.
Oh man, okay, so now where do we go to find your poetry? Where do we go to find the poetry of Mitch?
Well, I do have an Instagram, at Mitch Poetics. So that's always there. I post pretty regularly on there. This current collection that we've kind of been debating, this witchy collection, this magic collection, about impossibility, isn't on shelves yet. There's still several months from that, but it'll get there eventually, hopefully. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. I'd say as of right now, mostly that's it. Getting access to Mitch poetry is difficult.
I mean, but so right now it is accessible on Instagram.
Yeah, that's true. That's always accessible.
Yeah, and then hopefully it'll hit the page.
Hopefully.
How does that? I mean, that is an interesting part of being a writer right now, because like you said, what used to be tangible, which is how many copies did you sell? It defines your value as an author, as a poet, who's reading your stuff. Now, because of technology and how accessible work is online, it changes the dynamics. It changes how we can measure, like you talked about. How important is it to still get published at that point?
Yeah, that's the big question, honestly. And I think it's up to the individual person and what you want out of it. Because I think if you're writing poetry for yourself, then there's no incentive to get published. There's no need to. And you can write this kind of impossible poetry just for yourself. You can go into your journal. I hope anyone listening does. Go into a journal and just try to write a poem. Try to write a weird poem. Try to write a poem that only you could write, that no one else could even understand. Try to write a weird poem. And then who cares if it gets published after that?
Yeah.
It's more important to me that you take that poem and show it to your friends than it is that it would go out into the world and be published.
So dinner party, weird poetry dinner party is what we're doing.
Yeah.
Okay,
that's
cool.
the hope.
I like it. All right, everybody. Please send me your weird, impossible poems. I want to know what you ended up coming up with, but then also make sure you have a dinner party and share it all.
That's important. That's really
It's
important.
very important.
That's really important. Because it's just impossible to know how far your poetry has gotten out into the world. Even when you publish it, like you're saying, the advent of PDFs makes it that you can't know how many people are reading your stuff.
Right.
Right. The advent, I mean, in 2025, right, the Poetry Foundation's website, that's how I read probably most of the poetry I read, honestly, is just through that website. And there's no readings. Like, that doesn't tell you numbers, right? That couldn't tell you how many people have read this poem, how many people read that. So it's poetry. I think publishing is still important on some level for me because there's an ego thing. I want people to read my stuff. I
and
want
that's
it to
an
be
academic thing.
Yeah, there's something about a resume.
Right. Like as an academic, there's kind of that need.
You need to be published.
Yes.
Yeah, 100%. That's kind of the metric we get judged.
Yes.
So when your bosses look down.
If you want to teach whatever you want to teach,
mm-hmm.
you've got to be published. You've got to have these boxes ticked. You're just like, okay. So, and it's harder because, it's easy to put your stuff out into the world, but publishing it,
it's a whole thing.
It's a different thing.
Yeah.
It's different.
Yeah.
But yes, so I hope everybody will, one, go read Mitch's poetry on Instagram. That's what I will be doing. And then buying your book when it gets published. Please let us know.
Will do. I will.
Because that would be very exciting. And we'll have to have another podcast. We'll do a transnational
somehow.
Yeah.
Germany to
Zoom podcast. It'll be fine.
Yeah, we'll make it work. I'll be up at like 8 p.m. You'll be up at 8 a.m.
Yeah,
it'll work.
Perfect. I'm an early morning person. It's fine. I'll do that. I'll be that one. You'll have a beverage. I'll have coffee. And then the other one is, of course, to write your weird. Right? Mm-hmm. Your weird poem. And again, you can send it to Mitch. You can send it to me. We want to see the weird.
I would love to be sent weird poems. So DM me on Instagram. That would be awesome. Would love to read weird poetry. I do love reading weird poetry.
Oh my gosh. I'm like, man, I really hope people will do this. That would be awesome. But I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. And it's been so interesting, and I just have so many ideas and thoughts, and I just am so grateful that you took the time to come chat.
Well, thank you for bringing me. This was wonderful. I had a blast. I had a wonderful time, and I was really appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, everybody. So we're wrapping up, but just remember, all the world's a stage, and you too can be a shrew. Bye.